This video will look at how to create COBie outputs and assign classification systems in Autodesk Revit. The learning content will be identifying COBie assets, assigning the classifications, the setup of the COBie toolkit, and how to create those Excel outputs for COBie. When we're needing to use Revit to produce COBie outputs, there's a few things we need to check before we start. Most importantly, go to your BIM Interoperability Tools tab, the BIT panel, and click About, and ensure that the version of BIM Interoperability Tools that you're using inside of Revit aligns to any specific requirements that you might have inside of your BIM contractual documentation, such as your BEP. Once you've done that, and if you've defined or identified that you need an update, use your Autodesk desktop app to update. When you're ready to produce your COBie output, or at least configure your model ready to produce that COBie output, the first thing you might want to do is define a view that's only showing you COBie assets. COBie is only needed for assets or components that are defined within your BIM execution plan or other contractual documentation. To make my life easier, I will typically come in and use a selection filter to only show objects that are required for COBie. In this case, I'm going to do a selection filter, and then in the list, I'm going to deselect any components that I want to include in my COBie output. If you have a large list, it might be easier to say check none first. But in my case, we want to only leave selected non-COBie assets before right-clicking and choosing to hide those components, leaving us with a 3D view that we could rename to save for later, which makes it very easy to both identify, manipulate, select the components that we need to. Everything in this model, when we're working with a BIM project or a digital construction project, should be aligned to your common classification system. Here in the UK, when we work with digital construction projects or building information modeling projects, we use Uniclass 2015 for every single building element. That's not just the individual components, that's also things like the building itself and the rooms that the components sit within. On the BIM Interoperability Tools tab, under Classification Manager, click Setup to make sure that you are set up to use the correct database. It's worth pointing out the date that these tables are created, and also that you can browse to import later databases if this is out of date. Let's load Uniclass 2015. From here, we want to go through and classify every component, not just those relating to COBie. But for this example in this short video, we will choose to classify the COBie components. Let's zoom into the corner here and just choose one of these light fittings and one of these distribution units to classify. This is a generic object, so by default, it typically won't have a classification system assigned. By selecting that component and going to our BIM Interoperability Tools tab, Classification Manager, Assign, we can assign a Uniclass 2015 code and description. Before we do so, it's worth checking your classification options align to what you would want to set. I'd recommend the following options. Generally speaking, we'll set COBie parameters later, so leave this blank. This component is an element. We want to assign it, in this case, a product code. It might be that you need to identify which code or codes you need to assign against these products. Check the NBS online in the definition tables to identify or help you identify which codes you may need. In this case, it's a distribution unit. It's already filtered the list to air terminals based on the Revit category, and I can come in and choose the right code, either based on my knowledge, based on a search, or based on what I can see from the MBS definitions online. I'm going to select air diffusers and assign. If we close this and have a look at the type properties, under data, we can now see that we have a PR code and a PR description. Check your BEP with regards to which codes are needed against which objects and assign them as necessary. When you have a component that may be downloaded from a manufacturer's website or a very specific component, it might be that that component already has a unit class classification assigned to it, such as this one here. I would recommend that you always use the classification manager to assign components, even when they already have their own, and I'll explain why later. In this case, let's go back to our BIM interoperability tools and assign a classification for the component classification that we've just seen. So a 7070 48 85. Once you've been through and done all of your products and assigned them using the classification manager to make sure that they have the classification number and description, make sure you go in and select nothing. Assign a classification to the facility. You also want to make sure you use a 2D view or several 2D views to assign a classification to the spaces or rooms. Once you've done that for all of the components in your model, you're ready to proceed. It may be worth saving your model at this point if you haven't already. Every COBie data drop is typically done by an individual person. That individual person, as part of the COBie rules or standard, needs to be named. Therefore, before we go any further, go to the contacts under the COBie extension panel. If you've not done this before, you will have one defined as no email set. Select it and enter your details. You have a mixture of both required and optional data when it comes to COBie. So we fill out the ones that we need to fill out for this particular component. Once you've filled out all of your data and defined all the information required, we're ready to move on. It might be as part of your project, or in reality, that you have a set of options or configurations that you can import in. In this case, we're starting from scratch, but it's always worth checking your contractual documentation, such as your BIM execution plan, to see if there's any pre-existing configurations that you can use. To set up from scratch, go to Setup Project and run through the list top to bottom, starting with the general configuration options. Localization, identification of components, units that COBie needs to be produced in if they differ from what you're using inside of Revit, and then individual setups for each element. Remember that COBie is hierarchical. So we have a building that contains levels, and each level contains spaces. And inside each of those spaces or rooms, you have components. The COBie toolkit needs to know how it's going to assign locations for that hierarchy. Therefore, the first thing we set up is spaces. We choose where Revit can find the components, individually or en masse. This is just a sample project and probably very different to the project that you're putting together. In my project, I only have rooms. So therefore, I've selected room for all. It might be that the default options work best for you, or maybe you are M and E, and you need to use spaces for everything. Choose individually or en masse the appropriate options. We then have a name builder, and this name builder is the same for each of these tabs. What it will do is look at Revit properties, their values, and build a name inside of that COBie output. Check your BIM execution plan for any specific requirements around naming conventions on that COBie sheet. You may also want to check the COBie standard in the UK BS 1192 Part 4. In this case, to give you an example, we're looking at rooms. Therefore, my rooms on the COBie spreadsheet will be named room_1, room_2, so on and so forth. We can remove fields like this and add fields like this. Before defining whether we want all spaces in one or across multiple rows. Let's move on. The same name generator for types. COBie types are the same as Revit types. One type can have multiple instances. Name them as defined within your contractual documentation, and then set up how the category field will be defined. As I mentioned earlier, the category field needs to link directly to your common classification system, which in the UK is Uniclass 2015. Therefore, our first priority needs to be what we've set up earlier on, which is our classification manager Uniclass PR parameter value. It might be that with these manufacturer-specific components, we might want to go in and choose where it gets that data from. In my case, I only want it to use the Revit classification system to make sure that there's nothing getting confused or some discrepancy between which value it should use. This is the recommended setup. Choose how you want to build your description, and then move on to components to choose your naming for the individual instances of those types. We have a Systems tab where we can define the name for our systems using the same rulings as before, and again, the categorization of those systems, perhaps using the Uniclass SS systems code. Be careful with this tick box on the bottom right. Generally speaking, you would leave that blank unless you're wanting to put every single duct, pipe, so on and so forth into your COBie output. Again, check what is required of you inside of your BIM execution plan and other contractual documentation. COBie has both required and optional attributes. One way to cover this in COBie is the attribute sheet. The attribute sheet in a COBie document allows you to put customer or client specific attributes that they've asked for in one pick list or sheet. If you're being defined or asked within your contractual documentation to provide data that is otherwise not required in COBie, such as the fire rating for a door or a wall, for example, this is where you would come and define it. Choose the components, such as a door, a type parameter, and find fire rating. I'm going to do the same thing for a wall. Wall, type, fire rating. Only choose components and attributes that are required in your BIM execution plan. How to coordinate your components, either by a bounding box or a location point within the family file itself. And finally, choose if you want to add schedules for these COBie systems into your project, which will make the management of components easier. We do have the ability to change the parameter mappings. I wouldn't recommend you do so, but generally speaking, you have an output location in COBie, and then where it gets the data from. For example, on the component sheet, it's going to get the area from COBie.component.area. You can use these buttons here to add, edit, remove, or reset that mapping. Once again, I wouldn't recommend you change it. Once you've saved that setup, we have two more steps before we can start pushing COBie data through our objects. These are the different schedules that have been created. which make it very easy to browse through and edit, modify, and amend any data that we may need to. We have components that sit inside rooms. Generally speaking, from a COBie perspective, those rooms must be grouped into zones, and the likelihood is your project in reality would specify the same. So check your BEP and other contractual documentation to see if you need to have zones aligning to rooms. You add a zone like this, we give it a name, a category, and a description. Before selecting one or more rooms to add with a drag and drop. The preview and the model will update when selected. Once we've defined our zones, we need to choose which objects we need to export for COBie. Remember, this is just a view that we've created earlier on, so it's actually not representative of what's in this model. So therefore, we use the selection tool to choose which assets we have. In my case, for the example that I am working on, I want to export all of my air terminals, all of my doors, all of my electrical equipment. I don't want my floors, that's my slabs. I do want my levels to build the hierarchy inside of COBie. I want lighting fixtures. I want mechanical equipment. I want plumbing fixtures. I want rooms. And I want windows. Select your assets either by their category, or if it is as individual as specific types, you can select them here and apply and close. The COBie toolkit inside of Revit doesn't like working with groups. If you have any grouped components within your model, you will need to first ungroup them before they work correctly using the COBie toolkit. Once we've selected all of our components that are ready now for data, we go ahead and click Update. Before we do so, if we select this air terminal from earlier on and scroll down, we can see that it's got COBie data ready. These parameters are now ready to be assigned, both in instance, COBie.component, and in type, COBie.type. With the component selected, we can see that data. To fill it in with information, we use the Update tool to say which fields we want to fill out. The first time you do this, you'll want to do it for everything. Who is creating the COBie drop? If we want to have blank values set to non-applicable, blank data in COBie is not allowed, so any blank cell should say NA. Remember, we don't work with groups, so you have to either skip grouped components, which means they won't have COBie defined, or we ungroup them. Hit apply and close, and this will take a few seconds to a few minutes, depending on the size of the model, to generate that COBie data. Again, if I select this air diffuser, we can see that some of our COBie data is now starting to be filled out. This component is located within room 1. It's called Air Terminal 4. If we look under its edit type, it's COBie.type.category is our PR code and our PR description, so on and so forth. Go ahead and use the relevant schedule to fill out any other relevant information that may not otherwise be identified by the COBie toolkit automatically, such as warranty information, serial number information, if it's relevant at this stage. I'm going to open up a file that's already been completed to show you the next step. When you have a file that's full of COBie data and ready to be exported to COBie spreadsheet format, we can go to the BIM interoperability tools and choose to create the spreadsheet. Depending on the size of the model, that may take some time to create, but once it's done, if you open it up, we can confirm that we have now a full and valid spreadsheet that shows us the information about the facility, the floors on that facility, of which in my case there is one, the spaces on that floor or across those floors, their zones, and then finally the specifics around the building. Here's all of my types, and here's all of my components. It's worth pointing out that inside of Revit, you have tools such as the Revit Model Checker, which allow you to check validity before you run the COBie extension or COBie toolkit. That may help you in your quest to get a valid COBie output.